So firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you for everybody for coming. This is Civic Future's first public event since our launch in November last year. And just before I get into the subject, I'll just give a bit of a background about Civic Future. It was founded in autumn last year by former head of policy at Number 10, Munira Mirza. And it was essentially a response to the fact that over the last decade or so or more, we have huge challenges that we're facing as a society. One of the ones that we're discussing today, demographic shifts, but also economic stagnation, issues around identity and belonging, debates about Brexit and populism. And for a lot of people, it is felt that the leaders that we have, or the political leaders, are not often prepared or equipped with the kinds of intellectual and practical tools to face the challenges that we have today. And so Civic Future exists in order to identify and train current and future leaders with the philosophical and practical tools needed to face the big challenges that we have as liberal democracies. So it's non-partisan and it is really interested in all of the questions that we're talking about. So the reason that we wanted this to be one of the first events, I don't know if people have seen some of the articles that have emerged recently around birth rates. I mean, Aria featured in one just over the last couple of days. And there's been a lot of discussion in our societies, for example, around climate change. And for a long time, the primary discussion about demographics was the fact that perhaps there was too many people on the planet. But actually, over the last few years, there's been a kind of sudden shift in the conversation where actually people are worried about maybe there's not enough people. And actually, the Prime Minister of Japan in the last week said that the aging population is a fundamental challenge, an existential challenge to the continuation of Japanese society. And so there's questions around social care and pensions, generational strife, economic questions, but also cultural reasons. Why is it that a generation no longer potentially feel confident in the society that they're living in? And so this is some of the kind of questions that we want to discuss today. And so we brought together a very distinguished and exciting panel of experts and thinkers in this particular subject that will hopefully illuminate a lot of the questions that we want to explore. And we've got a big opportunity for questions and answers, so please think of your questions, ask them. One of the things about Civic Future is that we want to do lots of different events, not just kind of big conferences in certain venues, but also these types of events that bring different people together and really support the kind of intellectual and cultural life of British society, and that kind of democratic and collaborative endeavour can really raise the level of debate within society and help us to answer these kinds of things. So here we have Paul Johnson, who is the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. You might have seen him in many newspapers and in the media talking about the data and research about the economic situation that we find ourselves in. He's currently visiting professor in the Department of Economics at UCL, and he was awarded a CBE in 2018 for his work on economics and public policy. We also have Aria Babu. She is the former head of policy at the Entrepreneurs Network and the Female Founders Forum, and she writes a lot about pronatalism, transhumanist feminism, technology, and longevity. And also we have Louise Perry, who is a journalist and author based in London. She's a columnist for Unheard and a feature writer for the Daily Mail. She also has a podcast. I really recommend it. It's fascinating, Maiden Mother Matriarch, and it's a podcast on sexual politics. And she has a recent book that has been much discussed over the last few months, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, a new guide to sex in the 21st century. So really excited to have brought this distinguished panel together to talk about these issues. So I'm just going to start with you, Paul. So this is obviously a very big question. Demographic shifts, the aging population, there's lots of opinions, but what's the data? What's the research? What does it say? Or why should we kind of care about this?
Well, one of the most surprising things, and I didn't think 20, 30 years ago, I didn't think I'd say this, is that the fraction of the UK population at the moment who are over state pension age is exactly the same as the fraction of the population over state pension age 50 years ago in the early 1970s. So in a sense, we haven't seen quite the aging or the demographic change that we did expect actually back then. There's two big reasons for that. One, of course, is that state pension age has gone up, so the fraction of the population over age 65 has risen, but because for women, state pension age has gone from 60 to 66, and for men from 65 to 66 in recent years, that's helped a lot in terms of that dependency ratio, as it's called. And the second big reason is very high levels of inward migration. Nearly all the inward migrants are of working age, and they also tend to have more children than native population. So those two things have kept a very steady dependency ratio in terms of population of working age to population over pension age over a very long period, in a way that we wouldn't have expected, actually, if you look back 2 or 3 decades. If you look into the future, though, that changes. Even with the planned increases in pension age, the fraction over state pension age is going to rise from about 25%, where it's been for a very long time, to around a third over the next 40 or 50 years. So we've got that change in that part of the population in terms of dependency ratio in that sense. Now, that clearly has all sorts of consequences, but beyond that, whilst given the numbers I've just given you, actually the fraction over age 80 and over age 90, and indeed above that, has risen quite substantially over that period. I can't remember the numbers, but the fraction in the much older age groups is doubling and tripling over a number of decades. Now, that creates its own challenges, because that's where quite a lot of the cost of the health service comes, and obviously a lot of issues around social care. So if you look at expectations for government spending over the next 40 years, we expect spending on state pensions and benefits for pensioners to rise by maybe a couple of 2 or 3, 4% of national income, but spending on health and social care will rise by considerably more than that. Put those together, and in today's terms, we're looking at 200-300 billion pounds of additional spending just to keep what we've got at the moment. That's not to get anything any better. That's just to keep things essentially as they are. So the pressures on the public finances from an aging population are really quite significant. At the other end of the scale, in the short run, we're going to have a reduction in the number of school-age children. We've had an increase over the last couple of decades, and we're just about to go through, actually, a challenge for the university and further education sector, because we've got a bulge of younger of teenagers and going into from the end of school into further and higher education. Now, that's an opportunity for the higher education sector, who get £9,250 a year for everyone who comes into there. But it's also, a risk that there might be a smaller fraction who can find that space. But there are also challenges about, we're going to have fewer school-age children, and that's going to vary across different parts of the country. That creates challenges for managing school sizes and managing, are we going to get rid of certain primary schools and eventually certain secondary schools in some parts of the country? We're beginning to see that in parts of London already. Do we use that to increase spending per pupil, or do we use that to reduce spending on education? Big challenges. And actually, we've seen very different bits in different parts of the UK over the last 2 years. So there's been essentially no increase in the number of school-aged children in Scotland, whereas there's been a big increase in England over the last 15 years or so. The result, Scots have used that to increase spending per pupil. The Welsh, where there've also not been an increase in number of school-aged pupils, have used that to use the money elsewhere. So actually big choices in that context as well.
On that point, Louise, Paul mentioned big choices, and he also mentioned the idea that some of the reason why we still have a good ratio is because of immigration, that actually we've brought in people, working age people from other countries. That's also kind of caused some cultural tension within society, this idea that we should continually bring in different people in order to sustain our society in terms of the working age population. And so how do you view that, in the tension between bringing in newer people versus actually people within this society, not necessarily producing more people?
So I suppose there are a couple of things to say on that. One is that, can everyone hear me, by the way? The microphone boosts. Okay, cool. I have a tiny voice. One is that this is a global story, right? So birth rates are plummeting everywhere. I I can't remember the exact number, it's something like only 3% of the world's population lives in a country where birth rates are not declining. So it's not even just like it's just the rich world. It's basically everywhere except sub-Saharan Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa is likely to start approaching this demographic trend soon as well, which means that we can't just keep taking young people from the rest of the world, which has basically been our policy for dealing with this so far. Which, I mean, there are ethical problems with that, just because what we tend to do is take young, talented, energetic people from parts of the world that actually could probably do with retaining. You know, we take nurses from the Caribbean, you know, all of this stuff. That's not going to be a sustainable policy longer term, because everywhere is going to see the number of young people drying up. East Asia is getting there first, so to some extent, you know, they are they're offering a glimpse of the future for us. The other thing is, yes, that it does clearly cause destabilizing effects. Brexit is a clear example of that. Immigration has been treated as a sort of, if not quite a silver bullet, then certainly a reason not to have to think about this. I'd say within government as well as in the media and so on. I don't know if we can continue to use that as a to lean on that any longer. And I think, as you mentioned at the beginning, I think we are starting to talk about this a bit more. I think that there's increasingly an awareness that radically aging societies, I mean, because it's not just the enormous burden of having to pay for pensions, having to pay for healthcare, as Paul mentioned, it's also that we have fewer taxpayers. We have, at every end, we have a squeezing. And I honestly think that so much of what we're seeing already in terms of NHS on its knees, in terms of COVID, you know, like what COVID was basically was an enormous collective effort to protect older people, of whom we have an enormous number. And one of the things that medical technology tends to be very good at is keeping people alive, but it's not very good at keeping people healthy. So we have an enormous number of people who are really quite frail. And the reason we locked down was to try and protect those people, protect the NHS. You know, I'm not alone in arguing that the UK is increasingly a gerontocracy, where democratic power and economic power is disproportionately held by the old. So of course it is going to be in the interest of voters right now to protect the triple lock, to support lockdowns, all of this stuff. But unfortunately, those are exactly the kinds of decisions by government which make the whole problem much worse. And I'm sure we're going to get on to talking about people not having enough children, partly as a consequence of government policy.
Aria, I mean, some people would push back and say, well, in a way, this is a good problem to have, you know, people living longer and women having more autonomy over their kind of reproductive choices, that they no longer feel the social stigma to make decisions about children that they otherwise might have thought differently. And actually, this is something that we should celebrate in terms of human autonomy, but also technological ingenuity, which is allowing people to live longer. So is this kind of why it's been a difficult conversation to have? What do you think?
Yeah, I agree very wholeheartedly, actually, that in many ways we're very lucky to have this problem. I was watching a talk from the Tamil Nadu finance minister earlier today. So that's the state that my parents are from. And Tamil Nadu is in many ways an Indian success story because post-independence, they invested loads and loads in making sure that women were educated. They made sure that girls went to primary school as well as boys. And now they have pretty Western levels of human and social development. So the average person in Tamil Nadu graduates with a high school level education. Women work at much higher levels. They've got double the GDP of other states in India, and they also have a sub-replacement birth rate. And the Indian the Tamil Nadu finance minister was talking about how that's a massive success for our state. And I understand the impulse to say the things that have given us this problem are great. Basically, the only predictor of whether a country is going to have above replacement level birth rates is incredible levels of sexism, very poor educational outcomes, and extreme poverty. I don't want us to have any of those things. The real answer that I think politics now needs to come up with is how can we have replacement level children and also maintain these fantastic things that the modern world has given us.
And on a similar point, Paul, I mean, you mentioned some of the kind of data on these issues, but when it comes to social care, as we've seen in politics and in the discussion over the last few years, it's been very difficult for politicians to find the kind of political will to actually do anything when it comes to actually dealing with that challenge. So, I mean, are you worried that only when it gets really, really bad are we going to actually do something about it? I mean, why do you think that politicians have struggled to actually do something when it comes to dealing with the social care crisis?
Well, it's been extraordinary, hasn't it, what's happened on social care? I mean, we've been talking about this for such a long time, and the last Labour government didn't do anything, then put something in their manifesto which got shot down in the election, and that happened to Theresa May the other way around back in 2017, and then we had Boris Johnson making a very clear promise about reform, which is supposed to come in this September, and then in the last autumn statement, Jeremy Hunt said, well, no, it's not going to happen this September. So it's been genuinely shocking what's happened on social care. So there's a series of issues there. One is, which we talk about a lot, which is the structure of how much people have to pay depending on their wealth and so on. And that's the thing that's really not happening. If we're going to have social insurance, as we have for health and pensions and so on, then we ought to have social insurance, you'd think, for social care, and we don't have that. We have a means-tested system. But the thing that gets talked about rather less is actually we've simply just taken a lot of resource out of this system out of the last 13 or 14 years, so that there are fewer people who get it because there are, at least in a publicly funded sense. And then the third, really, I think the thing really impacts people when it comes to using social care. And anyone you've ever met who's had to deal with this system just finds it almost impossible to navigate. What's paid for, what's not paid for. There are thousands of different providers. The council's responsible for some stuff, the NHS for other things. Most of the providers are private, and finding a way through that. And you can find any number of stories about how difficult that is. And I think the reason that it doesn't get changed is that this affects a small minority of people at any one point in their lives. The people directly affected don't have a voice because they're the ones who are needing social care, and the people, their families are dealing with it certainly don't have time to have a voice because everything else is taken up in that. And then you also get this kind of confusion, I think, or this ongoing debate about what is the role of the state. So if you think the role of the state is only to provide in time for those who have nothing, in other words, a means-tested system, then something based on what we've got at the moment looks appropriate. But if you think the role of the state is to provide social insurance where people can't insure themselves, as in health, then you want to move to the system which, still legislated, we're going to move to. So I think there are a combination of almost philosophical differences which are not fully articulated. I think you've got a population that doesn't have a clue how bad things are at the moment until it hits them, and therefore it's very difficult for politicians to talk about. And then, of course, we've got a world in which, if you did meet all of the needs and move back to the spending per person we had in 2010 and so on, it'll become incredibly expensive. So it's a genuinely hard thing to deal with, given both the economics, the philosophy, and the politics around it.
And that's a really important point, isn't it, Louise? Because I think some people would argue that because aging is seen as kind of very far away, we have a culture that's kind of fetishizes youth, that we don't really think about people that are of an older generation. Because you kind of mentioned that a lot of the wealth is often concentrated with people at the older generation, but many people would also argue that they have to sell their assets in order to pay for care. So is there something that needs to be rethought of in terms of how we think about the relationship, intergenerational relationships, that actually something culturally needs to change? If we look at other cultures, oftentimes people, when they're younger, they look after the elderly, or the elderly live within the same home. And so there is much more of a kind of relationship there. Do you think that we're doing something wrong in how we view elderly people?
It's a funny sort of contradiction, isn't it? That on the one hand, old people have disproportionate democratic and economic power, as I've discussed, but are also thoroughly despised, particularly by sort of progressive culture, which is all about actually fetishizing the supposed wisdom of young people. It seems like the wrong way round. But I think it's probably not a coincidence. I think probably it's actually, I suspect that a lot of young people actually, part of the reason they're attracted to woke politics, which is very, very malignity and idiocy of older people is because they actually like deeply resent the economic disparities. But anyway, I mean, I think I'm supposedly going to get my state pension when I'm 68. I would be astonished if I do, because just that these lines are all heading in one direction, and the whole thing was basically a Ponzi scheme from the get-go. I mean, when the old age pension was first established, the dependency ratio was, I can't remember the exact numbers, but enormously different from what we have now. When the NHS was established, ditto. I don't think that the founders of either of those systems ever expected us to be spending whatever it is now, like 12% of GDP on those two things. It seems very likely that we will eventually just have. It remains to be seen how this happens politically, but I can't see any alternative except for those two things eventually to collapse in one form or another. And I must say, I mean, I have a lot of criticisms to make of the government, but I do feel sorry for them because I think that so much actually of what we're already seeing in terms of the unaffordability of the NHS and of pensions and of stagnant growth and all of this is already actually the early stages of this demographic crisis, except no one acknowledges it as such. And so the poor government, I shouldn't say this, but they are blamed for failures which actually are much, I think, more deeply rooted and which we are seeing worldwide.
Barbara, you write a lot about technology, and some people say that actually, well, with artificial intelligence on the horizon, great investment in technology and innovation will effectively solve our productivity crisis, and therefore we will have much more wealth within the economy to be able to spend on social care and these other things. So is technology fundamentally the answer?
I think technology can help. I probably represent a slightly strange worldview on this, where I'm probably more afraid of AI than most people, but also probably also on the flip side, more optimistic about what it could deliver. My probability distribution is probably just much more extreme than other people's. I think it is highly likely that AI will deliver us some significant gains in productivity, and that maybe it'll represent a deus ex machina, and we just don't need to worry about this problem at all. I think there is a chance of that taking place. I think similarly, there's a chance that we might decide that AI is actually very dangerous, that we can't control these systems, and we might need to slow down the development just in case we're in danger of releasing some kind of super virus or problem that can destabilize our nations even further. And separately, I think there are also risks that come from the fact that it isn't a surefire thing that AI is going to keep developing in this way. For example, most of the chips come from Taiwan. A war between China and Taiwan could completely destroy all of AI manufacturing for several decades. Which means that we still can't rely on it because there's no certainty in that situation. I don't think it's good to invest all of your hopes for the future of your society in one big technology that we might have a very good reason to shut down or might just shut down accidentally. So therefore, I think we do need to look for this alternative path as a way of making sure that our country and our world can continue to flourish.
Well, if technology, or if we can't be technologically deterministic and put all our hope there, then Louise, what can we do? Why aren't people having babies? Is it just a function of late modernity, that we are very individualistic and we don't really think about the future? The future doesn't really exist. And actually, when you look at many of the countries, Hungary, Greece and others, that have introduced pronatalist policies, even around childcare, that has been a discussion over the last week or so, it hasn't really made the kind of transformative change. When a lot of people say that they're not having kids because childcare is too expensive, housing costs and precarious employment. But actually, economically, that doesn't really seem to be what the evidence suggests.
Yeah, it's not even late modernity. It just seems to be modernity. I mean, I've written a lot about the pill and the social consequences of it. But the funny thing is, actually, when you look at the historical data in Britain and elsewhere, that birth rates were falling a long time before the pill came on the scene. And actually, the first demographic transition, so-called, when people go from having very high mortality and birth rates to dramatic falls in both, which occurred in Britain at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and then soon afterwards elsewhere, and is happening now in Africa. People already had much lower birth rates, even in the 19th century. It seems as though the things which kind of compose modernity, so urbanism is one of them, cities shred fertility, Lack of religiosity is another. Religious people have a lot more kids. Female education, as Aria was saying, like a lot of good stuff is associated with falling fertility. Just people seem to hit a certain level of affluence, and it's not even that high. It's not even like you need to hit the level of affluence of modern Britain to decide that they actually want to have fewer children. And you can nudge it. I mean, Hungary have nudged it. Georgia is another country that has successfully nudged it. It is possible to do these things. And I certainly think that what we're currently doing, we have all sorts of like anti-natalist policies, which we shouldn't have. You know, there are ways that we are making things worse when we don't need to. I think that we could improve things, but it's not easy and it's expensive. But also, this whole crisis is expensive. So it's like, do you spend the money now or later, essentially?
But Paul, attempts to raise the state pension age in France has caused huge, bitter protests. So even that end is seemingly difficult from a political perspective, that you can have huge backlash.
Yeah, I mean, we're not like France in that in that respect. We actually, I mean, I think it's one area, relatively speaking, where I think we have a relatively sensible debate about pensions in the UK. I mean, we've had increases in the state pension age, we've had auto-enrolment, we've got at least a debate about the level of the state pension. It was reformed back in 2015 to get rid of the earnings-related element and to give a bigger flat rate element, whether you think it's the right answer or the wrong answer. Actually, we're reasonably capable of having reasonable discussions about some elements of the pension system. We're not capable of doing that about health, for example, it seems to me. We may be getting to that point as the health service gets into such crisis that we really do need to start having a conversation about what is the right way of delivering it, what is the right relationship between individual and state on that. On pensions, clearly, you're always going to have some pushback from those who are going to lose from changes, and to be, you know, and the changes suggested in France are quite drastic in a sense, and they're talking about raising the state pension age by 2 years in a year or two's time, not as we have done, rather more sensibly, kind of say, well, let's tell you about it a decade or so, or in terms of women's state pension age, 2 decades ahead of when we're going to do it. People do need some chances to change that, but there's all sorts of bits of the pension system where, you know, the tax regime is, you know, a nonsense. The way that the public service pensions are a nonsense. There are all sorts of things that we could make better, but I think it's less impossible, oddly enough, than some other parts of public policy. At least that's my observation from what's happened over the last 30 years or so.
And Aria, it's not just a question of people not having babies. People aren't coupling up in the rates that they were before. So it's a kind of multi-pronged challenge. And so isn't that the domain that we don't really want governments to be involved in? You know, people's intimate, you know, relationships and the kind of decisions that they make about who they have a family with. Isn't that part of why it's so difficult to really respond to it from a state perspective?
Exactly. I think it would be insane if the government started a matchmaking service or something like that.
It'd be a really good way of killing Tinder, actually, to give the government power over it.
It might be better than dating apps, but I don't know. I think it'd be quite cool to bring back something like the London season, matchmaking.
Debutantes.
But no one wants to help me set that up. Yeah, I think that would be mental. That would be a big encroachment on people's personal freedoms. But I think, as Louise said, the state is in our way so often as part of this process. So one of the big things is childcare. We have the most expensive childcare in the world, or at the very least the OECD, because it's obviously quite difficult to measure some places. And that's basically because the state has made a series of decisions that other countries haven't made. We've got some of the most, I won't go into too much detail to make sure we don't turn this into a childcare thing, but we've got basically some of the most rigorous curricula, strictest ratios, and we basically banned a lot of informal childcare. So as a result, we've got very expensive childcare. We've got some of the most expensive housing of developed nations as well, especially in London and Oxford and Cambridge and places where young people who are trying to do things with their life often congregate. If the state could somehow legalize more abundant, cheaper housing, then that would probably get out of people's way quite a lot as well. If we didn't make it so difficult then I suspect people would probably have more children. And I think there's a massive other way that we can open this up, which is that so many people struggle with fertility. And I suspect almost every new person is going to be a lifetime taxpayer, with like some exceptions. So I think it's probably more cost effective than sort of current Treasury brain indicates to support more parents with IVF, maybe deliver something like universal free egg freezing, all kinds of other different things that could help people when they do want to have children, instead of trying to force people who don't want to into doing it.
And Louise, what do you think? What do you think some of those cultural things we could do in order to shift some of these questions?
I mostly agree with everything Aria said, which is slight disagreements. But the housing thing is enormous. The problem is, though, that, as we discussed already, it's, I think that we should be making it much easier for people who already have 2 children to have a third. And actually, if we just did that, that would solve an enormous amount of the problem. So we're not necessarily having to coerce people into having children who don't want to, or any of this stuff. I don't think we should be doing that, obviously. Even if we could, I don't think we should be doing that. I think that there are nudges that would help. And yes, things like housing. But so much of it is to do with culture, which is hard for government to intervene on. The fact, for instance, that religiosity is so strongly correlated with fertility shows us that this is independent of people's material circumstances, that just having sort of having meaning in one's life, possibly, or having local community. One of the things that it's such a small tweak, but I feel like it's so symbolic of the whole problem. The fastest growing type of household in this country is multi-generational household. And that's partly to do with South Asian communities being particularly keen culturally on multi-generational households. It's partly to do with young people not being able to afford to move out, so staying at home for longer. Regardless, it's a very popular household type, and it actually doesn't correlate that closely with poverty. People aren't doing it just because they can't afford to. People are doing it for a multitude of reasons. And it's bizarrely difficult to set up a multi-generational household, to do things like get planning permission to build a granny annex, for instance, or to just get a mortgage product which is suited to having multiple people's names on the deeds. Is surprisingly hard. That's the sort of thing where if we had, not everyone, if we just had a small number of people who wanted to set up that kind of household, it would help with childcare, it would help with elder care, it would help with household availability, because obviously there's a economy of scale thing when people live together. If the government just got out of the way a little bit, / encouraged banks to offer bespoke products, then that would be really helpful. So I think that there are clever ways around this, which don't always cost money. That one doesn't cost money.
And one more question before I open it to the floor, to you, Aria. I mean, some people listening to this might say, actually, well, there's too many people. For environmental reasons, we need to care about climate change. And actually, there's many articles about the birth strikers, the women that refuse to have kids because they think it's unethical, because particularly Western children are way more polluting than the kind of average person in the global South. What do you say to the kind of environmentalist arguments?
So I think the real crux of disagreement there is that I think we have very different solutions to how to get out of the climate crisis, or whatever you want to call it. I think there's one strand of thought which says we need fewer people, we need to consume less, we should stop eating meat, we should stop using plastic, we need to go back to a much simpler society that doesn't basically emit nearly so much carbon. I basically think that this, what I kind of dismissively call the anarcho-primitivist school of environmentalist thinking, is impossible and probably not very good to do. I suspect even if we could en masse agree as a country to do that, we couldn't agree on a global scale. So that there'd be no point. We'd immediately be outcompeted by a society that wanted to consume more. I think the only way outside of even more environmental damage than what we've already caused, is to innovate our way out of it. And it's pretty clear that one of the major inputs to higher levels of innovation are young people, educated people working on problems. The people who are most likely to come up with carbon capture and storage, alternatives to plastic, new kinds of energy, are just much more likely to be born in Western countries, and they're more likely to be educated in those places, and they're probably more likely to be born to environmentalist parents as well. So if you really want to innovate our way out of climate change, which I do think is basically the only solution that is viable, you probably are better served by having children than not having children. And I think I would especially add that economic growth is now further and further decoupled from carbon emissions. So that is a process that is already taking place, and I think it will continue to take place. So I wouldn't expect your children to end up consuming nearly as much carbon as you did.
Really interesting opening comments. So we're going to open it up to the floor. Please ask questions. Put your hand up if you have questions, and we'll take a few, then go back to the panel.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about your views on conceptions of adulthood and the extent to which that's modifying the situation and the problem. I mean, we now have increasingly large minorities of 20 and 30-year-olds across the developed world who live a child-free adulthood, not only in the sense that they have their own children, but they don't have anything to do with anybody else's either. And I think that the emergence of that idea of adulthood is important in regard to the issues you raise about generation and how we understand generation. But I think it's quite a unique situation for societies to be in, because definitionally, historically, you can't be an adult unless you have something to do with children. They're completely inseparable. Adult responsibility. What does adult responsibility mean? So I wanted your thoughts on that. The other question I wanted to ask, though, which is really gets at why we're even having this discussion in part. So to me, the adulthood question is very important. But one of the things that strikes me is that part of the reason why this discussion is occurring in the way it is about demography is because there is actually a very strong sensibility now of, I suppose, what I call a kind of reverse Malthusianism, whereby there is just a very strong conviction across the board that if we want to think about economic problems, we think about population and numbers. And I find that curious, because the only way that I can understand it is because it's occurring as a way of kind of subsuming or not even having any serious discussion about economic life, which is not actually to do with numbers. You know, you can have societies with loads of children that are very poor. You know, the wealth of a society is not contingent on the numbers of people in it. And the whole question of economic productivity and growth is a separate question altogether. And it does worry me that we have now a political discourse which is increasingly demographically determinist, instead of wanting, you know, how often does anybody now have serious discussions about economic life? They're just absent. And I think this is fueling that. So it's a separate problem. And so I think we do need to have a discussion about children and about adulthood. But I think that's a separate discussion to a discussion about economic life. Or they're not, you can't just squash the one into the other. And I find it interesting and worrying that the one is being squashed into the other to the extent that it is.
Thank you.
I thought it was really interesting. You were talking about things running down the track, and you were talking about Tamil Nadu and how they're very different. It reminded me of a speech by Mark Carney about the tragedy of the horizons, and about how different people have different impacts on different ideas of what's important at any one time. I was wondering, therefore, considering net zero, whether it's, you know, whether it's in that work or not, but it did focus people's minds and it focuses policy decisions. Is there a similar thing that has to happen on demography in any one country or across the world to focus minds, both in the private and public sector, on the issues that you raise?
And just one more question before we go back to.
I feel the conversation's tended quite a lot to the government getting out of the way. Given there seems this quite well-trodden moving from sort of a level of affluency to a declining birth rate, I'm sceptical of that. Because royal panels think of more deliberate intervention. I mean, I was saying in Hungary or some states in America where mothers are going to receive tax cuts or even direct money when they have children.
Do you want to start, Aria?
Yeah, I will. I've sort of like with these things, you kind of forget questions very quickly. So I'll answer yours. I definitely think there is space for the government to just give people money to have children. I think we obviously already do this a little bit in the sense that we obviously have some child benefits and we subsidize childcare. I think there's an extent to which maybe, yeah, we should just We should just like axe all of that sort of like complicated network and have a flat payment of money towards people. I have some concerns that it's a disincentive to work, because obviously if you're just given the money, you might have to pay like some tax on it. But if you're working and you're given the money, you pay higher rates of tax, and you can't just transfer that over to a childcarer because we have progressive taxes and income tax. So I think maybe something could be sorted out on that front. But yeah, I think definitely there's a space for just giving people money. If nothing else, having a child is very expensive. So if you want it to be an equal economic playing field between people who have children and people who don't, then I think the only thing you can do is subsidize having children to some extent.
And Paul, the point about economic life being a separate discussion, what do you think about?
Well, I don't know really. I mean, clearly, when you think about economic life, if you're thinking about women's role in the workforce, then clearly the way in which we subsidise or use or provide childcare is absolutely wrapped up in that. I mean, one of the things that sometimes working with economic sort of colleagues working on inequality and data and so on, some people will look back at the sort of 1960s and say, look, this was marvelous time. Inequality, as usually measured, household inequality was very low, growth rates were very high, it wasn't that sort of what we should be aiming at. Well, not if you're a woman, it wasn't, in the sense of very low levels of labour force participation, and if you were in the labour force, very low levels of wages. So and the way that the economy and the family develops, they develop alongside one another, and they develop alongside one another, partly because of the sorts of things that government does. So in terms of where is the role of government here? I think it is significantly about getting out of the way, particularly when housing and planning policy and so on. What is the biggest barrier, certainly in somewhere like London, to people thinking about families? It's clearly around issues around housing, and the tax system is absurd. It makes it very difficult for older people to move out of very big houses, and so on. But if you look at the sort of the tax and benefit system more generally, I mean, we impose huge marginal tax rates on people earning between £50,000 and £60,000 a year if they've got children, because we tax their child benefit away. If you're a fairly high earner and you're earning just below £100,000 and you've got kids, my God, don't go over 100,000 because you will lose so much. And you're talking about people who are doing the innovating and the sort of high flyers and so on. We're really hitting those people if they have children in a way that we're not hitting them if they don't have children. So we stop providing free childcare at £100,000. We stop giving tax breaks at £100,000, and we have very high tax rates above that level. So we've got a whole series of issues in the welfare system, in the tax system at the moment, which are as it were discriminating against actually generally better off families with children in a way that they don't without. So I think before we think about subsidising stuff, I think we should just think about stopping doing stupid things which we're doing at the moment.
And Louise, the point about the changing conception of adulthood, what are your thoughts on that?
It reminded me of this really interesting academic theory. I forget the name of the writer of this particular paper, but it's about the fact that modernity correlates so closely with drops in fertility. And their theory as to why this might be is that one of the features of modernity is particularly internal migration, people going to cities. And one of the things about migrating to a city is you no longer live around your kin. Whereas in traditional societies, people live around people they're related to all time, basically spend all the time with people they're related to in one fashion or another. We don't, I hardly ever see people I'm related to, partly because my family live in Australia, but still. So that does make it more difficult. The reason that would have a serious impact on fertility is that anyone who has ever hung out with their grandmother as a woman in their 20s or 30s will know the grandmothers really love it when you have children, and they will constantly ask you and prompt you and help you as well. Families help looking after children. That you could explain this in evolutionary terms and just say, well, it's because they have a genetic investment in these children, and so it's advantageous for them to offer resources in various ways. Whereas if you just spend all your time with people you're not related to, like, why would they care whether or not you have children? And it's something that I've really noticed in my peer group in London where I had my first child at 29, which is so young, so incredibly young in my circles, but nowhere else in the world. And there is a kind of vicious cycle where the fewer people are having children, the fewer children you see, the less it occurs to you to have children, the less incentive there is to have children, the fewer people can help practically. You know, you just don't like have any friends who actually have any childcare experience, who can do anything to help you. I've read, for instance, that in South Korea, which boasts the lowest fertility rate in the world, you will go around all sorts of places and see signs on restaurants saying no children allowed, like as if you needed to put up such a sign. But because it seems as if antenatal cultures kind of generate further antinatalism. People become less tolerant of children because they've never met any children, you know, and you sort of end up with this spiral, which suggests, therefore, that if we were going to try and halt that spiral, what we would need to do would be to encourage people to spend more time with their families. And which is, like, we don't do that. At the moment, we encourage talented people to move to London as quickly as possible and to stay there and never to go back, which is why things like multi-generational households, I think, are more along the lines of what we should be thinking about, as well as enormous tax breaks. I mean, I think we should be making it cost neutral to have children, because at the moment it's the worst financial decision you can make, basically, and that shouldn't be the case.
As a father of 4 children.
Can I just add to that very quickly, which is that I almost think it's too late for the spend more time with your families thing either. So my parents are South Asian, so, you know, they went on a walk, like me and a group of my friends, and my mum took my boyfriend aside and started like talking to him about, okay, what's going on with the kids thing? But like when I spend time with my boyfriend's family, they're like completely uninterested. He's white, they just don't care. Out of the 4 children that his grandparents have, only one of them, his parents, had kids. So it's like hanging out with like boomer white people does not increase your TFR like at all.
Yeah.
They were born in the 60s.
Yeah. No, completely seriously, I agree with you. It's true. Yeah.
We'll take a few more rounds of questions. Nina?
Yeah, I just want to go on something Louise said in the main panel, so meaning and religion, which I think is a very, very important question, very interesting question. And you pointed out, correctly, as far as I know, that the religious believers tend to have more children, right? Why is this, right? If you think that you're contributing to an image of the world which is incredibly beautiful, let's say your child is a fragment of God, that sounds great, you know. If you think that you're producing or bringing into the world someone who's a worker, well, that's pretty depressing, especially if your job is shit. If you think you're bringing someone else into the world who's just going to watch Netflix all the time, that's beautiful. You know, these are not like higher meanings. And I'm really wondering, at the level of a sort of deep theological, philosophical question, right, and this question of pronatalism and antinatalism, and I'm not saying we should mean people into being religious here, might be quite difficult, but these abstractions really do matter, right? So if we think of ourselves first and foremost as individuals, right, this is a relatively recent idea of who we are, right? We're not first and foremost in a relation, in a family, we're not members of a village or a town or an extended image of the world, or a nation. You know, I mean, you can't really talk about nation. I mean, look at the trouble NatCon are already in for using the word in their forthcoming conference. You know, because anything that has a higher value will be attacked as a regressive, reactionary, conservative, fascist, and blah, 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 right? So we end up with this individualistic, well, the asymmetry of the individual, which is totally tied to modernity and consumerism and selfishness, all those things follow. So I really would like to push all of you a bit more. And I think, agree with the language, you know, it's, of course, we have to talk in terms of population statistics and taxpayers and all that. But there is this really deep question to do with abstractions and human need for a higher meaning and a higher purpose, whether it's God or nation or where you live or something like that. And I wonder how all of you see that developing, if there's a possibility for that coming back in some form.
Take a couple more questions.
Hi, I'm feeling kind of really stupid after this amazing question that the lady just asked. As an American, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade last year, this is obviously the result of decades-long movement on the Christian right and seizure of the Republican Party in the United States. But could you imagine a world where other political parties might consider banning abortions as a solution to this demographic?
Thank you for raising the point of what you call abstractions. I think I would be inclined to call ideals. Yeah, transcendental. And it seems to me that Louise, when you were talking about the shift in industrialisation from rural to urban places and the breakage of the traditional relationships, well, the flip side to that was that it was a freedom. It provided a freedom for people to remake their own associations and communities out of their free will, whether that be around political projects or civic projects, fighting for libraries, fighting for the right to learn English, which they did with the extramural English classes, whatever it was, it provided a whole host of hitherto unknown possibilities for individuals to combine according to their own will. Now that, I think after a while, you can see that maybe that, things get out of kilter and there are losses associated with that. But I think it's so important to understand that to find ways of keeping what it is we want from the past without literally putting us back in the past. Because, this kind of trend at the moment to kind of fetishize the role of women as mothers and in the home. Okay, you can say that I'm certainly not against the kind of practical suggestions that would make life easier for mothers and for wives and childcare, things like that, and the kind of things you were suggesting, Louise, about the elderly and bringing them into social relationships more. I mean, that just points to such a loss of political imagination. Why aren't we building schools or reformulating schools? Okay, we might need fewer schools in the future, but let's build schools and incorporate them with old age homes, so the elderly people can be involved in story time, doing the craft things that they might know that newer generations might not be so good at. I think there's such a fantastic possibility, and it seems to me that it's the subjective factor that's getting in the way, at the subjective mainly from our political class, it has to be said, that they're absolutely not, they're so scared of their own shadows, they're so busy following opinion polls as to what the public want. They've forgotten that their job is to lead, to work out a vision, and to.
Yeah, so on that, the general themes about that, it's not just about tax cuts and different incentives. There's a kind of deeper philosophical question about the future and how we create it and organise it, and also the point about Roe versus Wade, and actually could we be creating a Handmaid's Tale type situation with our thinking about birth rates in the kinds of ways that we have. I mean, who wants to respond? Louise?
One of the things that's a common response one gets if you talk about birth rates publicly is that it just smells a bit fascist. Like the whole vibe is off, is basically the response that you get. And I want to argue against that really strongly, because it is modernity in particular that is threatened by this. It is what we see. What seems to be happening is modernity selecting against itself in a really systematic way. And anyone who values the joys of modernity, obviously it has its downsides, atomization, all of this, but we've mentioned female education, libraries, freedom of speech, all these things. Those are precisely the things that are threatened by basically the people who value those things not reproducing, which is what we're seeing right now. I mean, we were talking just before, me and Aria, about the fact that when are the Amish going to be the dominant group in America?
About 2,200.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds funny, but it's not a joke. Like, for real, the people who are having an enormous number of children are people who are particularly high in basically religious authoritarianism, which is a moderately heritable trait. And that is therefore the sort of worldview, the sort of politics that we would expect to see more of if this trend continues. Abortion has already been mentioned. Yes, I think that the task ahead of us, and it's a difficult task, but I hope it's an achievable one, is it possible to come up with a culture that is both values these modern things, education, freedom, the rest of it, and is fertile? Because if you can do those two things, like you're golden. You've cracked it. That is the thing. Because at the moment, it doesn't seem to be possible to have both of those good things at the same time.
And what would you say, Paul, as an economist? You're interested in the data and the numbers, but actually, it's not really the economic policy incentives that's going to address the deeper fundamental question about adulthood and the meaning of it, and the value we attribute to having children and its importance within society.
Yeah, well, it's obviously a whole series of things that that do that, and actually different countries of similar levels of development are very different in the number of children they have. I mean, Italy, which is not too different from us overall, have far fewer children than we do. And actually, they do have lots of multi-generational households, so there's certainly not a... but also they have very little in the way of either state-provided childcare or state-provided social care. But probably most importantly, they have for 25 years had a completely stagnant economy. And I think one of the dangers for us, of bringing it back to the economics, is when you've got a stagnant economy, when you've got those of working age getting a smaller and smaller fraction of the pie, when the pie isn't getting any bigger, and particularly when you've got the incredibly limiting planning policies on housing and so on, you're making it more and more expensive from a smaller sort of amount of money for families to have children. It's not surprising you have that kind of effect. So you can look across different countries which have, say, different levels of fertility, and the things that do make a difference are certainly fertility kind of drops dramatically as economic success goes up, and a very good thing too. We don't want everyone having 12 kids, as my grandparents or great-grandparents rather did, because half of them would die on the way. That's not where we want to be. But actually, when households, if you actually look at right at the top end of households in countries like the UK, actually they do have more kids because it's more affordable. It's if you're in the middle, particularly if you're in the middle in an expensive part of the country, then you don't. So the economic, these are long-term effects and long-term changes, which clearly affected by a whole series of social and community issues and so on. But they are affected by the economy and by the behaviour of government. But we should let Italy is a much more religious society. It's got many more multi-generational households. It's got a much lower fertility rate than we do. So these are really complex issues.
We were talking outside, Aria, about the danger sometimes of the pronatalist side. It almost becomes utilitarian. It's purely like the effective altruist is like, well, this is the most rational position. And is that enough that, it's going to continue the species? Or is there something, as Nina was saying, more ideal, something much more life-affirming that give people a sense of meaning and possibility about the future that they're going to bring their kids into that we need? It's not just a purely economic or rationalist perspective. We need something much higher than that.
So I guess maybe my entire life philosophy is some kind of combination of rationality with a drive for purpose and meaning. I think it's very easy to be rational in a way that makes you depressed and just giving all of your money to malaria nets in the global south, or obsessing about AI and all kinds of stuff. But I do basically think that a life that is only about those things is barely worth living. I do think that basically, and I think you hear lots of people who are parents reporting about how having children is suddenly the thing that brings them meaning. I kind of think the people who are superficially very obsessed with meaning are people who will go backpacking or to find meditation. I think they're finding it very difficult. But I suspect most parents, especially parents of young children, are not struggling to find meaning. I also think there is a deeply selfish reason I think you should rationally want to have children as well, which is about how like parents are happier. They're not happier like at the point at which they have children, but they're happy not happier at the point at which they have very young children, but they're happier like over the course of their lives. And they also say that the period at which they had young children was when they were happiest, which is I think like a very interesting, weird finding. I think it gives people a lot of satisfaction to have some stake in the future and to know that their life wasn't without purpose, and that like there's a degree to which that having been able to like find a person who has their genes and their culture and the ideology is a way of being part of that future. And to tie it to the questions, I do think a massive part of the reason we've seen this drop off in birth rates and people feeling invested in having children is that society doesn't really back you up as a parent. And you see this a lot with the economic stuff that we've been talking about. I think the reason that our politics doesn't feel a need to back people up as parents is because people go, well, that's a personal choice. You've decided to wreck your finances. We don't care. But also, like, society doesn't say, as a parent, you're like valuable. I think like a really good example of this is that if you want to raise your child with a particular set of values, the state will work quite hard to put them in a state education system that doesn't let you necessarily present your values as the truth. And that can be if your values are like any part of the political spectrum, the state expects you to have your children be a bit more like the average person than otherwise. I think the mainstream narratives, for example, are that you should be very gentle with your parenting, that you shouldn't wish for your child to have your same values, your same belief system, and that if you're too aggressive about this is kind of a form of child abuse, and that like their teachers won't back them up. Previously, your church probably would have said, honor thy mother and father, listen to your parent. That doesn't happen anymore. And therefore, when you have a child, and like I've got quite a lot of right-wing friends who are like a little bit worried that if they send their child to a state school, they're not going to be able to like control what they think about religion or any of these things, and that the state will actively try and take their child out of their culture. I don't know how you have a pluralist society where people believe a lot of different things and you also have parents getting to raise their children within their own cultures. But I do think that if you insist on making children like the mainstream culture, you're going to find it very difficult to have parents believe that they're passing on their culture and their values into the future without helping maintain their independence in this way.
No, I think that's a very good point. We'll take a couple more rounds of questions.
So if the private sphere is a set of choices you can make as an individual that the state has no interference in, and the public is where the state has interference, where do we draw the line in the future and now?
Well, we need to hold the state to account for doing what the state should do, rather than you sort of colonising all of these other areas, which I think has been the problem. I mean, I think the economic discussion is important, but it's very frustrating, isn't it? Because most of the form of the economic discussion is about consumption, not really about production. You know, you get a nod to productivity, but no one really knows what that means. Make it work harder, make it work longer, make everyone go to work. You know, I'm not talking about you, Paul, I'm just saying that in the general kind of media discussion, it's sort of, most of the discussions about economy and policy tend to be subsumed into this this idea of people, you know, we're consuming too much on healthcare and social care, and how do we kind of rake it back? So I think that's frustrating. And I also think, I mean, this relates to what you were just saying, Aria. I mean, I think we maybe need to think about social reproduction a bit more as the backdrop to individual reproduction, which means actually we need to think about civic society, which relates to the point about the state, because I think there is a sort of strange scenario where, as a society, we don't seem to like ourselves enough to want to reproduce ourselves. And so that, and I don't mean like, when you say social reproduction, it means, you know, people often interpret it as keeping small or insular. I don't mean that at all. You can say, well, the society we've got at the moment is great. But it does mean people live in different countries to their families often, or they certainly live in different places to their families. You can't look to the family, although you should recognise empirically that families do still provide a lot of care support, both for old age and children. But you can't just sort of, you know, but if as a society we sort of thought that was a good thing to be doing, and we're kind of civically pro-natalist as opposed to looking to the state to be pro-natalist, or to restricting individuals' choices as a way of encouraging them to have more children, I think that would probably be much more of a positive kind of
jumping off point.
At the back, picture.
Yeah, I was wondering about the extent to which having two parents and full unemployment affects birth rates. Because the idea of having a child as a sort of project to pass your values on to is sort of compromised by simply not having time to spend with them, and then paying for a third person to basically bring them up, or for schools to do that. And it seems that it hasn't necessarily helped people economically to have two parents in employment. Elizabeth Warren, of all people, pointed this out, that the influx of people into the workforce when women started working on a very large scale meant that the supply and demand dynamics corrected income, and people were actually being paid close to half as much in the long run. So you end up having two people giving all their time to their employers and paying a third person to bring their child up without their values. How is that a good deal? Could the government, without forcing women out of the workforce, which is not at all what I'm suggesting, incentivize certain women to, for instance, stay at home or work part-time, an opportunity to actually get involved in their child's life? Or mentally.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't really understand things in that way, because I think it's not so much about a question of how long you spend with your children. No matter how long you spend with them on a daily basis, you are the one that's ultimately responsible for them, and you are the one that's raising them, you and your husband or partner or whatever. So I think it's much more about what you think you're doing when you are raising your children. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're in the same room with them at the same time. It's the grander sense of the meaning that's attached to having a family. And we don't talk about family enough. We tend to talk about children, but we don't talk about family. And I think that's when we fragment the concept of family to caring for old people or having a baby. And then we don't really have this kind of holistic sense of what family might mean. And I do think that sort of fragmentation of meaning is a big problem, because if I was trying to think, well, how come on the one hand we seem to sacralise youth, but on the other hand we don't really like any youth? We think they are just, either they're mentally deficient in some way, or they're on TikTok or whatever. We don't really validate them in a sense of finding them beautiful or finding what they do inspiring. And we also don't really like children very much, or babies. So what is it that we actually validate when we're not validating older people? Where is it that we're actually locating our sense of value? Because babies since the late 90s have become just this kind of repository for society's ills. With parenting policy from the teenage pregnancy strategy onwards, was just this sense we are creating these deficient creatures when we have children, and these are all the problems that we embed within them because we parent them wrong. So somehow we've got to work on the meaning that we attach to family, and I think we need to understand it in a much more holistic kind of way.
Blimey, what a wide range of issues. I mean, two or three responses to all of that, and I think actually they link to one another. The question about sort of both parents working and so on is an interesting one. One of the things that's really striking looking at the data, though, is that families today, mother and father, where they're both working, spend way more time with their kids than they did in the 60s or 70s when one of them wasn't working. So people found the time actually to do both, to spend more time with their kids and to be aware. That's partly because we have so many labour-saving devices and so on, but actually partly because culture has changed. And actually, whereas it was fine, it was considered fine. I mean, when people talk about leaving them on Netflix or in front of their screens or whatever, most parents today actually realise they need to spend time with their kids. Actually, my parents didn't have a bloody clue back in the 1970s. So I think things have changed for the better in that sense. There's also an economic sort of more of an economic imperative now, of course, because there are so many two-earner households that actually the cost of housing has responded to that, which makes the choice more difficult. I mean, coming to the kind of what is the role of the state in all of this? Well, I think that's a very deep question, and that there isn't a sort of the state sort of butts out or does something. It's always a choice, and I mean that to go to this kind of question about what's the role with regard to families with very young children. So if you look at sort of 20 years ago, when you looked at most of the subsidy for families with very young children, that was focused through things like Sure Start on where the perceived and I think actual need of the child was. So when some of those programs are quite effective at resulting in children growing up to be more successful at school, but also more successful in society, less likely to be sick or criminalized or what have you. Today, and kind of after quite a long period of change, nearly all of that subsidy is now on essentially childcare to help parents go to work. So that's actually quite a big change, and we've got a whole new leg of the welfare state, which is providing free childcare for most working parents. And actually, we've got rid of part of that leg, which was to support the development of children. That's a big choice, and I think actually kind of the fact we're not doing so much of that supporting the poorest children is probably a bad thing for the long run of the country. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, if you look at social care, it's a really, it is true in some countries it is left to the wider family, and that's why social care I think is different from health, where actually it is part of the role of children and spouses and family and neighbours and so on to help provide some of that social care, in which they can't operate on your cancer, but they can sort of help you later on. And so the role of households and families relative to the state is a really, you absolutely don't want to crowd that out altogether, but you do have to get the balance there right. And that's, again, a really difficult conversation to have publicly.
What a delight to hear the two-income trap mentioned. A fantastic book, such an interesting book, and so unexpected from Elizabeth Warren, who's famous for being very left-wing, but there's some actually very conservative ideas in there, maybe accidentally in there, I don't know. Also, she basically predicted the 2008 recession, which was also very impressive. So all in all, a very interesting book. And yes, points out this problem that when you assume that all households have two incomes, all sorts of problems stem from there, because everyone is competing for housing and drives up prices in good school districts. And also, if one of you loses your income, it's a complete disaster. Whereas what used to happen is that generally the stay-at-home mother was in reserve as a potential worker if the father got sick or was out of work or whatever, and you could sort of deploy this extra worker. You don't have that now. It's completely impossible. So her argument is that now people are much more vulnerable to bankruptcy than they used to be. Obviously within an American context, but I think that's also true here. I think we need to raise the status of motherhood. And it was interesting actually when you mentioned, mother staying at home, and there was sort of a groan around the room, because staying at home is low status. It just is. It's particularly low status in postcodes like this one, where professionals congregate, and it is just. But if you look at the polling on what mothers and fathers think about this, overwhelmingly people want to spend more time with their children rather than at work, and there are a lot more women than you might expect who want to be stay-at-home mums and can't afford to be. The polling is so clear on this, and has been for ages, and we're going completely the opposite direction in terms of policy, because now the push is all towards having more and more free childcare, which I think is fine. The problem is that what we're basically doing is we're taking tax revenue from people who are scrimping and saving in order to keep a parent, normally mum, at home, and we're giving that to parents who are getting the income boost of going out to work, which I think is incredibly unfair. So I'm fine with having free childcare, but I just think we need to be giving a similar sum of money to people who are choosing to look after their children themselves. But the status thing is just really hard, because it is just such a widespread. This is basically the whole story of second wave feminism, that there is something a little bit worse about doing the traditionally womanly thing. And if that's baked into your culture, that it is just a little bit worse to do that, how on earth are you going to persuade all of these women in their 20s and 30s who are saying, why would I start a family and lose all of this and have a financial disaster on my hands? And this is kind of what I mean by the culture problem. I mean, I don't know, can religion offer that, the status attached to motherhood? Christianity kind of did used to do that, but yeah, I don't know.
We'll have one last round of questioning. What about the point about reproducing, the joys of social reproduction?
So I think that is like a large part of my reason to sort of like want to have children is that like I like myself. I think there should be more people like me, and that does seem to be the easiest way to do it.
My kids are nothing like me. I wouldn't bet on it.
It's like I feel like probably, and I would have been so upset if you told me when I was 16 that this would have been like what would have happened. But I am probably basically like an average towards of the two of my parents. Yeah, I guess it just turns out that way. I think you're right that like one of the easier ways to deal with this problem is to just help people stay at home. And I think there is something to the two income trap arguments. Although there's like a really frustrating thing that is like it wouldn't be true if we just built more housing. The reason people are spending so much of their incomes on housing is because we haven't dealt with the problem of there being a lack of supply. So everyone's using every single penny they have to keep bidding up prices so they can be some of the chosen people who get a house. So I don't think that we have to have that as a problem that we're presented with. But it is, to be fair, the problem that we're presented with. And oh yeah, and the other thing, like I think it was your question about cultural stuff, is that like the social contract between generations seems to have completely broken down in most families, where like you see lots of people who leave the house at like 18 or maybe, you know, after they are done with university, and their parents are kind of like, okay, I'm done with my investment, I'm now going to retire. This is like a really strange thing to happen evolutionarily. Humans are like, along with a couple of other like large social creatures, basically, are very strange in that we've evolved to keep living after we stopped being able to reproduce. This is because historically, for most generations of human beings, grandparents have been so crucial to the survival of their grandchildren that it was worth spending extra resources on keeping them around. To have old people just like, and old people are not that old when they're sort of like 60, 70, 80. I know so many people who are like below 80 who are actually quite healthy. Like,
Hey.
it is true.
Digging a hole here. That's some of us are nearly 60.
So my granddad's 75 and like currently still beats people in their 20s in bicycle time trials. I don't think it's very strange to come across like very healthy 70-year-olds now. So the idea that like you sort of like, when you're older, you just kind of like pack it in and have fun and you don't actually help continual generations of your family is, I think, really alien to what it is to be a human being, but also a mainstream part of philosophy. I think there's something should be done to sort of repair that so that children definitely feel like more deference towards their mothers. I kind of like think it'd be cool if we could bring birthdays into being like a celebrate your mum kind of day or something like that that shows that you're... So something like that, but also a sense of like duty towards continuing generations of your own family, like a sense that your legacy in that case actually matters. And I don't know how you reconstruct that social change, but it would be really useful if we could.
Last round of questioning. We don't have loads of time, so I'm just going to take lots and lots of points.
Thank you. On religiosity, I think definitely the higher ideals is absolutely right. I think there are two more things that have been talked about elsewhere that I do think link to church life. My wife and I go to a church in London, both away from our families, and our congregation are not the 60s, the white boomers who are not talking about it. We are constantly being asked, you know, when will we have children? And I think, were we not both teachers as well, it is one of the few spaces that we do actually see children, the way that we don't when we spend time with our friends and everything. Just taking it back to social care, we've talked about how technology would help maybe pay for social care. I'm wondering how wary should we be of technology being used as a substitute for human connection in social care?
More points?
Yeah. On the question of the role of the state, I mean, I agree with you, Paul, that yes, you know, families should be taking far more responsibility for their own. How, you know, the state is not actually supporting families to do that. And your point about the system being incredibly difficult to navigate, it is. You've got this artificial division between the NHS, continuing healthcare, for example, and then local authorities' social services. And the families are having terrible battles trying to get
one side to actually accept responsibility for the for assisting in the funding of the care, but also, on the cultural question as well, I think we need to be moving away from, we will always need care homes, but we need to be moving away from that institutional model and helping families, supporting families. And, people can't afford to give up their jobs and end up on, income support, in order to do that. So there needs to be far thinking about how do we support families, financially, but also practically. And would it be an idea to end this artificial division between the NHS and social care?
So slightly different question, but one of the trends we've seen in the UK in recent years is actually that demographic shifts aren't even. So places like Norfolk, for example, are very old in comparison to somewhere like London. To what extent do you think that's a problem government is going to have to tackle? And if it is a problem, how should government actually deal with those inequalities and those different pressures on public services?
Oh, thank you. I'll just answer. I can see if that's okay. I was just wanting to ask, thank you, it's been really informative. One question that I wanted to ask though was within the discussion about demographics, I feel that the matter of identity is also quite central to it. Obviously, a lot of countries within the Western world have undergone, obviously, a lot of demographic change, and that's why we're here. I just wanted to highlight, it's coming up to St. George's Day, but about this time last year, Steve Khan, Mayor of London, said that I'm a Muslim of Pakistani heritage, and I'm paraphrasing, but and a lot more things. But what was important was he said, and this isn't a contradiction, I'm just as English as anyone here. My best friend is living in Japan right now, which is obviously a very homogenous society, and he knows damn well that if he said, oh, I'm ethnically English and culturally Christian, and that makes me just as Japanese, they'd probably take that. But this isn't to, please don't get me wrong, this isn't to say that anyone of a background non-Indigenous to these isles can't be here and enjoy themselves and indeed be as English as anyone else. But there has to be some sort of parochial nature to the question of identity, does there not? Otherwise, we'll end up in a state of alienation, and where to the point that was made earlier about Norfolk and London, you'll end up with entire sections of the country that have different sets of values to other sets of the country, and will become a patchwork that won't be able to agree on anything. So I just wondered how we might broach and bridge that divide as well.
Thank you. It's interesting, Japan is really experiencing one of the lowest birth rates, so it is a complicated picture. Any other?
Two quick questions. I think one was building upon Japan. So if you look at Japan, say the integration of robotics into social care, actually limited on what the Chinese with the relaxation of the one-child policy. My second question is, there was a point in time in which your children were in pension. That was certainly the case for my grandparents. And as the dependency ratio shifts and the state pension no longer is sufficient to support everyone, do you think there'll be a point in time again in order so children will support parents?
We'll take one last question.
I think my question is, where is the incentive for young people to actually reproduce? I think obviously we've had a lot of conversations about morals, religion, higher meaning, but if we are in a society where housing is unaffordable, student loan costs are high, where is the actual incentive for young people to reproduce? And I think that's where a lot of the resentment we spoke about earlier comes from in society. I think religion is on the decline country, the census show that's not the answer. Neither is giving some abstract concept of higher meaning. It's what practical considerations can the state make to make it easier for young people to reproduce and contribute to society going forward. I don't think that's been a particular consideration over the past few decades whatsoever.
Thank you. And I mean, the panel won't be able to answer all of those questions, but there has been a reoccurring theme between the higher ideals, the kind of cultural questions, and what are the kind of practical policy proposals that could be implemented to incentivize and change people's behaviour. So that is a real tension that has emerged. Just final comments, thoughts, responses from the panel. You, Paul?
Well, I fear I may be taking Aria's answer to the last question. It's build more sodding houses would be the obvious answer, at least over the long run. Two other points worth making. One, this sort of issue about you raised the issue of children being the parents' or grandparents' pension. It's very much the other way around now. The amount of money going down the generations is huge during life. Which is an indication of the value that parents or grandparents do put on children, because they do put a lot of money in after they've left the home. Of course, that creates social inequality, because some people get a lot of that and some people don't get any of that because of how well off their parents are, and that's become much more important actually as asset values have gone up and as earnings have stagnated. Actually, your parents have become more important in purely financial terms than they have been for decades, probably for 100 years, to almost return to Victorian values in that sense, and not in a way that I think is particularly good. I mean, the values are good in the sense that people want to support their children, but the consequences are less social mobility. On the very specific question of should social care be more integrated with the NHS, I don't think it should, for exactly the reasons that we set up. It's just a different kind of thing, and the NHS is already 10% of the entire economy. Giving it even more to do, and it doesn't do what it's supposed to do at all well, I think would not be a good thing, partly because, frankly, A, it couldn't cope, and B, actually it is just a different thing, operating on some, health, at one extreme, healthcare is something that has to be delivered by a specialist in a specialist institution, and at the other extreme, social care is something which can be delivered by your family or friends or whatever in your home. But you do need to get it, and there's clearly there's a very, very fuzzy border between all that. It's incredibly complicated, but I would keep them personally separate, because I think the issues are not about the separation between the two. They're about the completely hopeless way in which we organise and fund social care.
Aria?
I would actually, so I'm going to take the very last question because that's how my memory works. And actually step away from a lot of what I've already been saying about how, obviously, housing is important and the way we fund childcare is important and all of these different things, and say, while I agree that there are policy and economic things that we could do to shift the dial on whether or not people have children, I think it is silly to think the idea that we are too poor to have children is the reason that we don't have very many children. Almost every generation of your family going back was so much poorer than you were. My grandma was one of 13 in a 2-room house, and that didn't they had discovered the withdrawal method at that point, and that did not stop them from having children. The same is true for basically all of your ancestors. Why did your great-great-grandmother have a child when there was a 10% chance it would kill her? I don't know, but clearly something has shifted very dramatically, and just making this a conversation about economic incentives, I think, ignores how much culture has changed. So that's, I guess, my concluding statement.
I agree. I mean, I think that having children is low status, and a lot of people look at the economic cost to themselves of having it, and they reason that the loss of status is not worth it for however much they like children. Particularly because a lot of people don't really like children that much in the abstract, and then actually really like their own children. I've heard that, so including from women, I've heard that so many times, and I wasn't that keen, and then my own baby is amazing. So it's one of those things you don't know how you're going to feel about it until you've done it. And an enormous number of people, they never set out to not have children. They just drift into not having children because they don't find the right person at the right time, because, you know, all these things kind of line up. But as you say, all of our ancestors did it in two-room shacks and like, in both senses, yeah. It's not actually a hard impediment. It's just combined with a lack of will. People just don't really want to do it. I mean, one incentive to everyone in the room, I think our children are our pensions already, because I actually don't think there is going to be a state pension waiting for me and for anyone else in my age group. So, like, if you need a personal incentive, it's that one. Like, I'm completely serious. That, yeah, go forth and multiply, because the state's not going to be there.
Well, on that message, thank you to our brilliant panelists for really fascinating points. A special thanks, Aria, for stepping in. Miriam had to drop out last minute because she had to go to a vote. So thank you so much for stepping in, Aria. And thank you, everyone, for coming in these really important and interesting questions. So round of applause to